name is Melissa Estable, and I work with the Cooperative Housing Federation of Canada. And this panel will just pass the mic here to do the introductions. We're going to cover off in the first section a little bit about the basics of co-op housing to understand the ecosystem of co-op housing. Then we're going to dive into, each of us is going to speak a little bit about a specific example of a community land trust that involves some co-op housing. And then at the end, we've got a couple of set questions, and also there will be opportunity for you to ask some questions here of the panel. So I'm playing a bit of a dual role. I'm moderating the session, and I will also be speaking about one of the land trusts based in Toronto.
Ouais. Bonjour, mon nom est Daniel Trudeau, je suis gérant de la... J'entends, je pense que ça me mélange. Daniel Trudeau, je suis gérant de condo, c'est-à-dire que je suis gérant du syndicat de copropriété de la communauté Milton Park, dont vous avez amplement entendu parler. Ce que je vais... je n'ai pas de préparation en tant que telle, c'est au fur et à mesure que je vais peut-être avoir des idées. Là où on est rendu, nous, comme la plupart des coopératives de certains programmes et des OBNL, au niveau de la communauté Milton Park, les 15 coopératives et 6 OBNL en habitation, c'est qu'on est rendu à la fin de ce qu'on appelle nos conventions. Donc les groupes sont dans une démarche, pour la plupart, d'entreprendre un plan de rénovation, de bilan de santé. La très grande majorité des groupes ont une capacité, comme ça a été mentionné tout à l'heure, une capacité financière beaucoup plus grande de ce qui va être dépensé en rénovation. Il y a donc dans Milton Park à peu près 144, plus ou moins 144 bâtiments. Il y a peut-être, de ce que j'ai saisi, peut-être à peu près 6 millions de dollars d'emprunts, plus ou moins, dans différents groupes, peut-être un petit peu plus. Ce qui fait qu'il nous reste 130 millions à investir, à imaginer. Évidemment, la très grande majorité des groupes, je pourrais dire tous les groupes, ne sont pas rendus à cette réflexion-là. Moi, je commence à l'aborder un peu au niveau du conseil d'administration. On essaie de s'ouvrir à ce qui est possible. Et cette fin de semaine-ci, j'espère, va nous amener à réfléchir davantage.
Thank you. My name is Tom Armstrong. I'm the Executive Director of the Co-op Housing Federation of BC and the Community Land Trust.
Bonjour tout le monde. Hi everyone. My name is Celine Carrier and I'm the Executive Director with the Cooperative Housing Association of Eastern Ontario, or CHASIO, which is the regional association in Ottawa for housing cooperatives. I'm also part of a group looking at land trust development in Ottawa. Oh, sure. I'm going to do just a quick scan of the room and check in on where people are from and what sort of their comfort level or knowledge is of cooperative housing before I dive into the basics and maybe go too basic. So just a show of hands in the room, who here would describe themselves as understanding what co-op housing is? There's some familiarity with co-op housing. All right. Great, so about half the room. So, who lives in a housing co-op? Okay, cool. Who has lived in a housing co-op? Totally different. Okay, great. So I'm going to give you a bit of a sense of the scope of co-op housing and what exactly it looks like here in Canada before we dive into further conversation around the intersection of co-op housing and land trusts. So to give you a sense of the scope of co-op housing in Canada, there are about 2,203 to be exact housing cooperatives incorporated in Canada. That represents 91,500 units of co-op housing. So that means that that represents less than 1% of the housing stock across our country. Co-ops house approximately 250,000 people in Canada, and the average housing co-op actually ends up being just under 60 units on average. And so we have a spectrum of scale. In Quebec, as a rule, the number of units in housing cooperatives tends to be lower than across the rest of the country. In Ottawa, to give you a sense, our smallest housing cooperative is 4 units. Our largest is 244 units. And in comparison, the largest housing provider, landlord, nonprofit or for-profit, is actually our public housing provider in Ottawa Community Housing, and they administer over 16,000 units of affordable housing. So to give you a sense, if you combined all of the co-ops in the membership of my association, we'd be just over 4,000 units. So scale is an interesting perspective when you start looking at how co-ops are structured. In Canada, the vast majority of housing co-ops, and certainly the co-ops that are members of any of the regional or national associations, tend to be non-profit, non-equity stake cooperatives. So that means that they tend to be owned on a non-profit basis. The membership of the co-op are the residents of those co-ops, and the decision-making is democratic. But there isn't an equity stake, so that means that no one is buying shares, no one owns their own home. As a rule, there are co-op models where home ownership or equity or ownership within the co-op does exist, but that's not a model that is predominant in Canada. And I will point you to, I saw Julie walk in. I don't know if Julie LaPalme, are you in the room? She walked out. I'm hurt. No. So there is someone here from Co-op Housing International, so I'd encourage you to seek her out or go and visit the Co-op Housing International website if you're interested in learning more about co-op housing models around the world, because there are different ownership models throughout the world, but certainly in Canada we have a non-equity stake. So the other predominant piece of co-op housing, and those of you who are familiar with co-ops will know, is that the membership is linked to occupancy. So in order to have a voice or a say in the functioning of a housing co-op, there's a link to living in that housing co-op. So there isn't an external governance structure in place affecting the strategic direction or how the co-op serves their members. It's based on sort of a by members for membership mentality. And co-ops are governed in accordance with the cooperative principles. So I'm going to do another quick show of hands. Who in the room, if you're familiar with what a co-op is, how many of you are familiar with the cooperative principles? Okay, so I could spend 8 hours talking about that, and I won't because I'll... Cool, all right, so so basically co-op principles are based on a set of internationally agreed to principles based on voluntary membership, member economic participation, democratic member control, autonomy and independence for members, education, training, and information for the members who control that co-op, cooperation amongst different co-ops, so we work together to serve our various memberships, and then finally, concern for community. So those are the principles that govern and shape cooperatives, and those are integral to our model and how we function, and I'm sure as the conversation progresses, we'll find that they're also integral to how the land trust model becomes an interesting opportunity for housing cooperatives. So in terms of how housing co-ops are organized in the country, and I should speak a little bit to the funding piece as well. So one of the big challenges for any cooperative across the world, whether it's housing or credit unions or worker cooperatives, agricultural co-ops, is having access to capital. And that's certainly been the case for housing cooperatives to this point as well. So Tom mentioned quite eloquently in his last presentation that we have to work on getting out of this reliance on public dollars in order to be able to build housing and serve our communities. And certainly that's been the trajectory so far for housing cooperatives. So there's a a number of different funding programs from a number of different levels of government in the history of co-op housing that have led to the creation of co-ops, but by and large there's been a reliance on CMHC or provincial funding structures, in some cases municipal funding structures, to develop housing co-ops as we know them today. And so it's important to recognize that where we are at in 2019 is really a bit of a change of the guard in terms of where housing co-ops are in their evolution. Many are coming to, or have already come to, the end of their original operating agreement or funding agreement with government, which means that there is some level of flexibility or some level of crossroads for individual housing co-ops and for the sector as well. That poses opportunities and challenges or risks, but that means that for many co-ops, the original conventions, the original parameters that they were developed under are getting burnt in these mortgage burning parties that co-ops are having across the country. So the other piece that's important to context piece would be to look at the federated structure for housing cooperatives. So there is a network or a scattering of housing cooperative federations across the country. So CHF Canada is the pan-Canadian structure. CHFBC is obviously the provincial federation out in British Columbia, and I believe it's the only, no, CQCH is the other provincially structured federation. In Ontario, we have a network of 5 regional smaller co-op housing federations, of which my organization is one. In Alberta, there's SACHA and NACHA, so Northern Alberta and Southern Alberta Federation. And those federations exist to try to support access to scale and capacity for housing co-ops. So each federation is a little bit different, but does a range of education, advocacy, bulk buying services, and in many cases management services for their members as well. So I believe outside of Quebec there's a network of, or there are 9 regional federations across the country, and then within Quebec, I'm not going to be completely positive, I want to say that there are 8, FISHIM being one. And their membership in the National Federation, and I'm looking at you from FISHIM because I'm probably wrong on this, but I believe that the membership in CHF Canada is through the regional federations in Quebec, whereas the rest of the country, housing co-ops are members directly. So I'll hand it back over to Melissa.
Thanks, and that's a really great sort of overview of the ecosystem of co-op housing in Canada, where we came from and how we ended up where we are right now. And I like that you brought up the funding structure and the end of mortgages, because this represents a really excellent opportunity for housing co-ops to re-leverage, and there's development opportunity that's built in to that this sort of moment in time as mortgages are coming up. So that was our introduction. Now we're going to take 10 minutes each to review some of the co-op participation in community land trusts. And so I'll start it off since I have the mic. And forgive me, I'm not from the Co-op Housing Federation of Toronto, but there's an agreement between CHF Canada and CHF Toronto to look at the land trust that is held there. And the land trust in Toronto is over 31 distinct properties in the GTA, and it represents over 4,000 units of housing. And the majority of these co-ops are actually under provincial agreements, and their mortgages aren't coming up for some time. So we're really getting ahead and doing some planning now, so that when those mortgages come up, we'll be able to perhaps borrow from CHFBC and use these assets to create a type of engine for growth, especially in the Toronto area, where housing costs are so, the market is so hot. So I've got notes, again, this isn't my presentation, but came from the Federation in Toronto. So there were 4 original land trusts, and they were started off in the late 70s. They were really brought up from opportunities that came at the time. One was the Tenants Resource Group. I don't have that exactly right, TNRC.
Tenants Nonprofit Redevelopment Corporation.
Thank you, Joshua. Tenants Nonprofit Redevelopment Corporation. And so there were tenants there, they were tenanted buildings, and these were converted into housing cooperatives and moved into a land trust owned by CHFT. There were several others, the Co-Land Co., which I think literally was Cooperative Land Company, and the Bathurst Key Community Land Trust, which emerged from a specific opportunity where there was some federal waterfront property, and it was allocated for co-op housing. And so in some cases, and with Bathurst Key being one of those cases, the land trust actually leases land from the federal government, and the co-op operates on its own in its own day-to-day way. And then there's a new land trust called Naismith, and this land trust was set up to hold sort of like Section 37 contributions. So these are, it's a tool of the municipal government when there are additional units that are built by the private sector that are, rather than putting money into a fund, they're turning units over into the community sector. And so Naismith recently acquired 12 units of condo, and it's a new way of looking at how to operate a cooperative within a condominium building. I think it's 180 units. It's a massive condo tower, and then there are 12 housing co-op units within that structure. So it's a new model, and we're sort of testing out if that would work as an approach. So that's a brief overview of what the co-op housing land trust in Toronto looks like, and like I said at the beginning, what we're looking at in the future is really about how can we take they're partially owned by the sector, and we're looking at partnering with the co-ops and really engaging with the co-ops to see what can we do next. In some cases, the land can be intensified, and the residents who are living there right now, other than having sort of some construction next door, are not affected by that. There's just free and vacant land. And that's really the starting point to really begin the growth engine. So we look forward to talking more about this as projects get off the ground. So I'll turn it over, we'll just pass the mic down the row. Danielle, si vous voulez parler un peu de Milton Park.
Bon, pour vous expliquer Milton Park, j'aurais besoin de contribution des 2 premières rangées, si vous voulez vous lever et vous être ici. Sauf monsieur.
Il connaît trop.
Oh, pauvre Mathieu.
Oui. Bon, Milton Park, c'est la coop du Nord-Est. C'est la coop Milton Park, c'est la coop du chez-soi. C'est un OBNL en habitation qui gère 130 unités, des chambres. C'est ici la commerçante, un autre OBNL qui gère des commerces, ainsi de suite. Ça, c'est le syndicat de copropriété Milton Park, que nous, on appelle une forme de fiducie. Ici, nous avons monsieur et madame qui prennent des photos, qui viennent nous voir, qui sonnent à la porte du gérant et qui disent sur la rue Brébeuf, sur le plateau Mont-Royal, à 20 rues, 15 rues de notre quartier, qui nous disent il y a 24 unités de logement qui est à vendre. Et ils m'appellent, moi le gérant, mais il appelle beaucoup de monde. Et là, moi, je me dis, qu'est-ce qu'on fait? Qu'est-ce qu'on fait pour sortir 24 unités à vendre du marché spéculatif? Là, j'en parle à quelques administrateurs. Vous pouvez vous asseoir, vous n'êtes pas des administrateurs. Ils sont sur mon conseil d'administration, sur le conseil d'administration de la CMP, et on réfléchit. Qu'est-ce qu'on peut faire pour aider les résidents de la rue Brébeuf qui viennent d'apprendre que leur maison a été vendue? Ils sont 24. Financièrement, c'est des locataires. Alors, comment les aider? C'est des questions qu'actuellement, on commence à se poser. On n'est pas rendu là au niveau de la communauté Milton Park. Ces personnes-là, maintenant, se transforment en personnes du troisième âge. Cheveux blancs, cheveux gris. Alors, on les réunit, on pense avoir une douzaine de personnes dans le quartier, et là, tout d'un coup, ils sont 35 à une rencontre comme ici pour trouver des solutions parce qu'ils habitent des grands logements sur 2 étages. Les enfants sont partis. Alors là, on se demande comment on va faire pour trouver des solutions pour nous, les aînés. Ça s'appelle le groupe des aînés de Milton Park. Comment on va faire pour trouver une solution, libérer des grands logements? Comment on va faire pour construire, acheter? Alors là, aujourd'hui, au moment où on se parle, on est en train de réfléchir à ça. Et peut-être qu'une fiducie, acheter un terrain, il y a l'Hôtel Dieu, il y a le projet de récupérer des terrains de stationnement. Alors, c'est les questions qu'on se pose tranquillement dans Milton Park. Et ce qui peut rendre compliqué cette dynamique-là, c'est que chacun des groupes fonctionne de façon autonome. C'est là le défi qu'on a, nous, au niveau du syndicat de copropriété de Milton Park, c'est d'unir nos forces pour dire « OK, on va dans la même direction ». Merci aux administrateurs.
That was fast. You skip rope. Thanks. Well, I don't have props like that. So I was hoping that Celine, when she did her survey, was going to ask if there were people who fell into the group of living in a co-op but didn't understand what a co-op was. But in Vancouver, there would be a few in that population. Anyway, so I'll do my own survey. How many of us here were just in the auditorium?
Well, some of them were here and listening. Some of us were here but listening.
Ah,
Does that
okay.
count?
Yes, it does count.
Okay.
Yeah, I was totally unaware of that. All right, so I think I can dispense with about half of my slides, which is good news for you, and even better news for me. But I think this topic is so important, the intersection between housing co-ops and community land trusts. Closer. Yeah. Nobody ever says they want to hear me more clearly. Okay, you do. Very small, very select group. But I think it is critical for the future of our movement. At the Co-op Housing Federation of BC, our mission is to unite, represent, and serve our members in a thriving co-op housing movement. And what that means for us is, in our vision, growing a community of permanently affordable co-op housing, with the emphasis being on growing. And that's something I want to come back to, because I think what the co-op housing movement has been lacking is an internal engine for growth. And has been dependent, as I said a little earlier, on external inputs and forces to be responsible for its own growth. So you've seen our numbers, you've seen our distribution. You didn't see this one, I think. The average co-op in BC is 54 homes, which is interesting because it puts us kind of smack in the middle. It's half as big as the average co-op in Toronto, and twice as big as the average co-op in Quebec. So we're kind of in that middle ground. About 70, close to 70% of the co-ops in BC own their own land. A third lease it, either from a municipality or a pension fund or an educational institution. And as I said, all over the map, high density, low density. We just acquired this property, by the way, Haney Pioneer Village Housing Co-op out in Haney. 12 acres, 85 units. As soon as those buildings come to the end of their useful life, it'll be a massive redevelopment partnership. But the beauty of this partnership will be, it won't be the co-op at the mercy of a private developer, which is usually what happens when housing developments come to the end of their lease and they get sold off by government or whoever happens to own them. Now that the Community Land Trust owns the property in an asset transfer from the province, the redevelopment project will be a partnership between the Land Trust and the co-op, and the seniors, whose average incomes in this co-op are $21,000 a year, will be promised security of tenure and affordability in perpetuity as part of that redevelopment process. Heritage buildings, as I said, colorful buildings, high rises, that's one of our new buildings acquired from the City of Vancouver. So I also want to make the point that we're part of a strategic alliance that we call Housing Central, which really is the key stakeholders in both the co-op and the nonprofit housing movements pooling their resources, including a co-location of our offices, to work together to pursue our mutual interests and our joint missions. Something that has troubled me for a long time is how comfortable we've all become in our silos, whether we talk about the government or the community housing sector. We've had this attitude for so long that whatever we need to accomplish, we can accomplish on our own. And in BC, we've discovered that we have much more in common with our, in the co-op sector, with our nonprofit partners than divides us. And we have a growing alliance now that allows us to pool resources in areas like communications, government relations, IT backbones, and a lot of the other functions or tasks that we used to rely on our own resources to carry out. So the key stakeholders, again, though, from the co-op housing sector or the Co-op Housing Federation, Coho Management Services, which is a wholly owned management subsidiary of the Federation, and the Community Land Trust. You've seen the number of occupied homes in the Land Trust, just over 800. And the homes we have under development through a variety of partnerships, primarily with municipalities. This is the key, one of the key discoveries that municipalities have come to in BC is that where they don't have the resources to start up a municipal real estate development corporation, their only choice used to be partnering with the private sector or private developers to deliver on their affordable housing goals. And that has changed. Now that there are options in the community housing sector, one of which is the Community Land Trust for them to partner with to deliver those affordable goals. And that's producing far better outcomes for municipal governments, the provincial government, and for the community housing sector. And is turning, I think, into a partnership that will last for a long time. And one of the keys the keys to the relationship we have with the housing co-ops that are part of the Community Land Trust is that we've been able to take some of the functions or some of the management functions that you would normally attribute to the individual co-op and move them to the portfolio level. We chatted a little bit about what makes people nervous about co-ops. One of the things that makes co-ops nervous about their own governance and management model is that they often lack the scale or the capacity to deliver on the goals they have for themselves post-operating agreement or post-retirement of that mortgage. So in the land trust model that I'll happily admit that we stole from a group that you would be well advised to Google. They're a very interesting crowd. Common Equity Housing Limited. They're in the southern part of Australia. And Common Equity is a company owned by 200 housing co-ops. And the co-ops lease their land and buildings from the company that they own as shareholders. And what it has allowed them to do is move some of the key functions like insurance, reserve fund investment, debt service, and particularly the relationship with government from the individual co-op level to the portfolio level. Governments love it because now there's a single point of contact. In the common equity example, instead of 200 agreements to administer and 200 co-ops to have a relationship with, they have one set of agreements and one relationship with common equity. The co-ops love it because their relationship with government is virtually extinguished, and they can say that's somebody else's problem, which for those of us who spent careers, yeah, you're smiling, dealing with CMHC or provincial housing authorities sounds like a match made in heaven. But it also, not only is it a convenience, but it actually bulks up some of the areas where we've had capacity issues. I mean, ask yourself, for 200 housing co-ops, how much sense does it make to have 200 capital reserve funds, 200 investment strategies, 200 insurance policies, 200 operating agreements with government? It's not a set of relationships that was designed to wring the maximum efficiency out of the landscape. And moving from an individual to a portfolio level operation allows you to achieve economies of scale where that makes sense, and leave critical functions that are critical to co-op members at the level of the individual co-op, like community development and the quality of life that we've all come to know characterize the co-op environment. So, and this conversation becomes important. It's more important now than ever, I believe, because we're at a point when a lot of co-op buildings that were developed in the early, in the years of government-funded housing programs, the big ones being from 1972 to 1991. A lot of those buildings coming to the end of their useful lives, a lot of mortgages being retired, unless you were a leaky co-op in BC when you've got mortgages now for the next half century. And real questions around what to do with the asset, the real estate asset that you now own or have a long-term leasehold interest in, that will be in the best interest of not only your members but future generations of members. And that's a set of challenges that individual co-ops and the volunteers who sit on those boards never had to wrestle with, at least outside of Quebec. So when you think of the things that you would describe as the strengths of the co-op housing movement, this is kind of the list that we all grew up with. These diverse communities, the not-for-profit model that's delivering, I would say, an exceptional return on the housing investment to government. And in many communities, this is certainly true in BC, one of the few remaining stocks of family-sized housing. You look at all those cranes popping up in downtown Vancouver, you know they're not building 3-bedroom homes for people. They're building studios and ones to market to investors, not people who think it might actually be a good idea to live in a little tiny box in the sky. So those are the things that people love and cherish about the co-op housing movement. But let's face it, we have our challenges. Our buildings and our members are getting older, oddly enough at exactly the same rate every day. The asset base that we have, well, all of the things that make co-ops wonderful, intimate, supportive, diverse communities, when you flip the scale and start to think of them as a real estate asset rather than a community, that disaggregated base means a real problem in leveraging the asset for future growth, for refurbishment, for renovation, and that's a problem. If our goal is not just one generation of disposable housing, but a multi-generation approach to co-op housing. Let's face, again, I can only speak from the BC experience. Our record on asset management has been inconsistent at best, in that annual collision between short-term affordability and long-term sustainability. All too often the asset is the loser in that equation. Not in every case, not even in the majority of cases, but look at it from the point of view of a lender or an investor. If you said that 20% of a housing portfolio had shown signs of deferred maintenance and asset neglect, how does that affect your underwriting exercise and the interest rate or your willingness to assign a mortgage or a loan to that property? So all these years our small scale has has produced a quality of life that our members have found very desirable and very rewarding, but it hasn't created any kind of engine for growth or redevelopment within the sector. And to me, that's the weakness that the community land trust model allows co-ops to overcome. So we always ask our members to imagine a future in which they keep all of the things that make co-ops fabulous and the best investment in affordable housing that the government ever made, but actually create a way of leveraging assets, create a way of providing long-term stable asset management to the portfolio, and to create partnerships with government, between government and the community housing sector that make the government want to invest, and investors want to put their funds into a growing co-op housing sector because it's developed those vehicles to aggregate assets and capacity and access to capital in ways that produce great results for everyone. And that's really what a community land trust can do. It's all about scale without having to merge individual co-ops. It's a way to generate capacity. It's a way to get access to capital, whether it be debt or equity, all through the building of partnerships that make a difference in people's lives and in communities. And that's what we've been able to do so far. We've been able to rescue assets that were in distress, develop new co-op and nonprofit homes, allow our members an opportunity to engage in a partnership with us that provides for a redevelopment, in some case a densification of their housing, excuse me, and at the same time create a deep and permanent affordability within those communities. Now, I'll just give you one very quick example of a co-op out in the Fraser Valley. 94 units, a mix of apartments and townhomes. When we were asked to work with them as the community land trust, a 30% vacancy rate and $1 million in arrears in its mortgage to CMHC. So the co-op went to the bank and said, would you lend us $5.5 million to fix this problem? And the bank said, no, because there was no evidence that the money would produce a change in behavior that led to a 30% vacancy rate and $1 million mortgage arrears. So they asked us if we would go to Van City Credit Union and ask for the same amount of money. It was about $7.5 million in the end. And Van City said, of course, but only if the asset is transferred into the land trust and the land trust assumes responsibility for the debt. And that was fine. So that's what happened. CMHC, to their credit, somebody should write down the date and the time because I'm about to give publicly credit to CMHC for something, which I don't think I've ever done before. Because they didn't deserve it. Anyway, they agreed to allow the asset to transfer into the land trust, so title changed, but the subsidy continued until the end of the operating agreement, which was about 24 months post-transfer. So that's a good thing, good for them. And then we bought them out. This is why the asset was allowed to transfer, because about $1 million of the 7.5 was used to buy CMHC out, which of course protects the mortgage insurance fund, victory for CMHC, and then put $5.5 million of renovation into the development. And the end result is a full co-op with a waiting list, people walking in off the street asking if they can live there, the best looking housing in the neighborhood, a waiting list, fully funded reserves, and a cash flow surplus delivering net operating income so that the debt service is not a problem. And the co-op preserves its own governance. The only thing missing from their old experience is the hassle of managing the asset and managing the debt. They get to manage the community the way they always did, and that's for me a good outcome, not only for the co-op but for the sector. Our land trust staff even figured out a way to engage volunteers in areas of maintenance and landscaping that they were used to being involved in ways that didn't compromise the long-term asset management program going forward. So what's made this tough? We have a long history of doing things a certain way in the co-op housing movement. We all taught it, right? Workshop after workshop. And the weight of what we now call the legacy co-op model is turning out sometimes to be a difficult ship to turn. Some co-ops have been absolutely fixated on the notion that in order to engage in a land trust relationship, they would have to give up title to their property. I remember one of the members of Bakerview, the co-op I just described, said that at the very last meeting before they approved the transfer. He stood up and he said to us, but you want our land. And our land trust director of development just looked at him and said, how's owning your own land working out for you so far? That's the 30% vacancy, $1 million in arrears co-op, right? So they moved past that. It turns out when you're a nonprofit corporation that can't distribute assets on dissolution to its members, the only thing that title to a piece of dirt gives you is the ability to mortgage it and go into debt. And that didn't seem to be a very attractive benefit of owning the land when it came time to the opportunity to pool the asset. And lastly, I'd say we have a well-honed, highly sophisticated aversion to risk and change in the co-op housing sector. We like ourselves just the way we are, and there are more people who say that change needs to happen than who actually want to change. So that's something that we that gives enthusiasm to our efforts with our members each and every day. So looking ahead, I really do believe that we're on the verge of finding that that what I call that sweet spot between short-term affordability and long-term sustainability. We are absolutely on the cusp of generating capacity not only for stewardship of the asset but for growth over the long haul, and this is going to be a game changer for municipal, provincial, and federal governments as we provide an alternative to them giving away the store or selling the farm, whichever metaphor you want to use, to private developers in order to accomplish their affordable housing goals. They can now do it through the community housing sector. And I'm happy to say, and I'm sure you're happy to hear, that I'm out of slides.
I mentioned at the beginning during the introductions that we're working with a group exploring land trusts. So I think this is maybe a tale of two different ends of the spectrum in terms of where we're at in Ottawa. And exploring land trusts certainly inspired by some of the land trusts that exist across the country. So I'll say up front that we share many of the same challenges and experiences as Tom has described. Housing co-op members are members of their co-op because they want their co-op to provide them with good quality affordable housing. That over time in many cases has created an invested interest or an interest in preserving what exists. So the housing co-ops that exist now and trying to make sure that this is good enough, this is meeting our needs now, and so co-ops are coming to the point where they're starting to decide that good enough isn't good enough anymore, and that we want more, but that aversion to change that Tom was mentioning is a bit of a challenge, and we'll get into that. So to give you a bit of a sense of where Ottawa is at, so it hasn't hit the news in the same way that Toronto has or Vancouver has in terms of the housing crisis, but I can tell you that we know that there are over 100 families every night living in motel rooms because we don't even have the shelter capacity to house families. So for more than a year at a time, families of 5, 7, 10 people are living in a hotel room while they wait for adequate housing. And often the housing that's presented to them is in fact not adequate. We know that there are over, and we've been saying forever, 10,000 people are on the wait list for affordable housing. We know that that number is actually much higher. We're closer to 12,000 people are on the wait list for affordable housing in Ottawa. And that's only a drop in the bucket because according to CMHC, more than 40,000 people in the city of Ottawa live in core housing need, which means that they're paying for housing that is not affordable to them. So the housing that they're paying for represents more than 30% of their income, and that it's not adequate, that it's not safe. So that's the context that we're working within. We have 53 housing cooperative members within Chazio's association, and they're existing housing providers structured in small business structures, and their priority as individual housing co-ops is to continue to serve their members. That's how they were built, that's how they were developed, that is their focus. And so our challenge is to find that engine for growth in Ottawa as well. So that brings us to the group of organizations that are talking about land trust development in Ottawa. So this, funny enough, didn't come out of a desire to, initially anyways, to look at affordable housing development. This actually came out of a group of housing providers in Centretown in Ottawa that needed a new district heating plant. So 3 housing cooperatives, Alex Laidlaw Housing Co-op, which is 36 units out of its original operating agreement, townhouse style development. Dalhousie Housing Co-op has some of their units because they're more of a scattered site co-op. So they have 76 units, and some of their units are on this piece of land and access the district heating plant. And then Tompkins Housing Cooperative, which is a seniors co-op, and I can't remember how many units they are because they're not in our membership, but 70-something units of co-op housing dedicated to seniors, along with some units from Centretown Citizen of Ottawa Corporation, which is the second largest nonprofit in the city of Ottawa, and then some units from Ottawa Community Housing, which is the large public housing provider that we mentioned earlier, are all on the same parcel of land leased through CMHC. There are also a number of private leaseholders on that land. And one of whom is our city councillor, who is the council-appointed liaison for housing and homelessness, so that bodes relatively well. And some of those private leaseholders, so homeowners on that leased land, have also formed community associations. So this group came together initially to start talking about this district heating plant, and along the way discovered, hey, we're on leased land in Centretown. We know the influences and the pressures of gentrification. We've seen it further west, we've seen it further east, we've seen it across the city. Maybe we should be having a conversation around land use and trying to make sure that the affordable housing that exists in Centretown exists in perpetuity. And so that's where the desire to start looking at land trust development came into play. The lease, and Kaylee, who's the manager of 2 of those co-ops, is here today, and we were taking a look at the lease this afternoon. So from what we could tell, it was signed initially in 1980. It was initially a 40-year land lease with an opportunity for renewal, but if it doesn't get renewed, then 36 years later, it can be renewed for another 35. It's the most convoluted document ever, which is in true CMHC style. But basically, there's an opportunity for lease renewal. And the challenge really is that there may be an appetite at the point of lease renewal to renew, but there's no guarantee that that land use will continue to provide affordable housing in perpetuity, because that piece of land is also right next to LeBreton Flats, which is one of the prime pieces of real estate in Ottawa that is sat vacant because it needs a lot of land remediation. And for those of you who follow Ottawa politics, there was a big land development that is in the process of going belly up. The owner of our wonderful sports team in Ottawa is in the courts battling with the other person who proposed the development. So there's a whole lot of drama around LeBreton Flats as well. And this piece of land sits adjacent to them. So we are not incorporated. We are not yet incorporated as a land trust, but there's certainly a lot of interest, and we're looking for inspiration today in trying to figure out how we, ensure that that parcel of land continues to provide affordable housing to those in that neighborhood who need it. That 2, we as a community housing sector in Ottawa, so not only housing co-ops, but the affordable housing sector, develop an engine for ourselves to be able to pursue the development of more affordable housing going forward. And three, that the representation within that land trust structure is appropriate. So that's the stage of conversation that we're at. Melissa and I are working on governance structure, consultation, and visioning. So we're in the middle of some really great iterative discussions. And what I would say is, whereas in Montreal, in Toronto, and Vancouver, where there are existing land trust structures and where there are there's existing capacity to drive some of that development and drive some of that the transformation of the sector. We in Ottawa are not necessarily in that same spot, and so we are very focused on taking a partnership-based approach and looking at the partners who are already on that land and making sure that we're developing something that is representative of the housing co-ops and the nonprofits that are there and more broadly throughout the community. So the other piece that I'll leave you with is that we learnt a year ago, maybe more, there have been whispers about an existing land trust in Ottawa that we kept trying to figure out where it was and who held it and what it looked like, and so finally we found the lawyer who had sort of supported this thing that actually wasn't a land trust. So there was a parcel of land that holds 2 different housing co-ops and 1 nonprofit, where they didn't want to sever title because that was just going to be too expensive. So the alternative was to create a numbered company that owns that piece of land and leases the land to those housing providers. And there are lessons to be learned there because there was no one sort of keeping track of it, no one filing the paperwork, and it dipped into losing its incorporated status a few times and then was pulled back out of the fire like a phoenix. But potentially is something that's going to be able to be pulled into the land trust, and that potentially we'll be able to leverage because it's actually quite close to it's something that we'll be able to leverage moving forward as long as we create something that is citywide and not neighborhood focused, which is, I think, the intention, but lots of conversations yet to come, and a lot of consultation with neighborhood stakeholders, with First Nations, community health and resource sector within Ottawa and beyond. So I'll leave it there and hand it over to Melissa.
Just shared a co-op housing principles both in French and in English, so it'll filter its way back. And so we're kind of into the question and answer portion of the panel today. And one of the questions that I'd like to kind of kick off with, and if I had had one slide today, I would have put up the community land trust principles that I learned last year in Pittsburgh at the Grounded Solutions Network. But I'm going to see if I can remember what they are, and if I can't, maybe somebody here can help me. So the community land trust principles, I actually may have them written down here. Forgive me, I'm a little bit disorganized. Yeah, right. No, and that's why I said if I had one slide, that's what it would have been. Okay, I've got it. I've got it here. So community land trust principles, and I saw it was a presentation. It was an international panel, and the presenters had actually sort of gathered together just before the panel to review these, and do we agree this is what they are? And I don't know that there is, it's written in stone or whatnot, but this seemed to be, there seemed to be some general agreement around what a community land trust is, and organized around 5 principles. One being voluntary membership, The second being collective land. The third being individual homes. The fourth was community control. And the fifth was about perpetual affordability. So when I saw that and I kind of cast my mind back to the co-op principles, I saw the alignment, and so I'd just like to ask the panel about if you were to pick up one of the co-op principles and speak to it and how it lines up with the community land trust model. That would be our first question.
So I know as we were getting ready for this that Tom sent an email saying that he reserved the right to answer cooperation amongst cooperatives, so I'll leave him that one. But for me, I think concern for community is the one that has been standing out more and more. Co-ops, by their very nature, are more inward focused. The membership of housing co-ops exists to serve the needs of their membership. And that's a good thing, right? They're preoccupied by the need to make sure that the members who live, their neighbors, the members who form their cooperative are well supported and well housed and well taken care of. There has been a great success at practicing concern within housing cooperative communities, and I think where there's a link to land trusts is where housing co-ops can begin to practice concern for the broader, or can continue through land trusts to practice concern for the broader community. So looking at the co-op housing movement's responsibilities in Ottawa to house the 12,000 people who are waiting for affordable housing, the 100 families who are living in motel rooms, and the absolutely unacceptable conditions that children are having to face, leaving a motel room in the morning to go to school, or watching their parents make dinner in a microwave in their motel room, and that's all they can face for a year. We have to start taking responsibility for that as citizens of the broader communities that we live in. And land trusts are one way of contributing our equity and contributing our capacity towards a solution for a broader community need. So that's the one that I would choose.
That's a really good one, but my question is, what's wrong with making dinner in a microwave? That's the limit of my skill set in the kitchen. So that is absolutely true. In fact, the extra room, the extra financial room that the Community Land Trust has given us in BC has allowed us to invest in a range of partnerships that we never would have had the opportunity to contemplate co-op by co-op. So we have agreements now with Community Living Society, whose clients are adults with developmental disabilities who will now find permanent homes in co-ops through the Land Trust. We have agreements with the Society of Transition Houses, providing a guaranteed number of homes to women leaving violent relationships through the vehicle of the Community Land Trust, and also a fund paid for in part by developers to provide interest-free loans to those women if they can't afford the share purchase to get into a co-op, and the same model used through a disability trust for people with permanent disabilities. So there is a benefit to scale that can translate into concern for community. But for me, the classic co-op principle that the Land Trust illustrates is cooperation among cooperatives, just in the same way that not every individual can meet their own housing needs in this market, and that's the benefit of a housing co-op to them. There are limits to what an individual housing co-op can accomplish as a long-term strategy for asset management and redevelopment and growth. And those ambitions, those aspirations can be achieved not by compromising their autonomy or giving up their individual co-op organizations, but simply by aggregating those assets in a relationship with the Community Land Trust, where they retain their individuality and autonomy as co-ops to the extent that it makes sense for them.
I just want to comment also on the fact that that the housing co-ops in BC own that land trust, right? So they are member owners of the Co-op Housing Federation of British Columbia, who then in turn own the land trust. So that just is perpetuating the autonomy and the ownership within the system, right? It's a system or sector-owned organization and structure.
Yeah, there's a quirk in the Society Act, the Nonprofit Act in BC, that allows a society to have one member, or a sole member society. So the Community Land Trust that we operate is a nonprofit society, the sole member of which is the Co-op Housing Federation of BC. So when the board of CHFBC meets to do the business of the federation, it's also meeting to do the business of the land trust. It's also coincidentally the same model we use for our captive management company. It's also a non-profit society, the sole member of which is CHFBC.
Dans notre déclaration de copropriété, nous, la dynamique qu'il y avait au début, pour mettre ça sur pied, la propriété, pendant les rénovations, c'était un organisme qui s'appelait Société d'amélioration Milton Park, qui pendant tout le temps des rénovations du projet en était propriétaire. Après, la question qui s'est posée, c'était comment transférer les propriétés aux différents groupes qui étaient ici tout à l'heure, aux coopératives. Est-ce que chacun des groupes allait devenir une entité individuelle? Et la crainte qu'il y avait à ce moment-là, c'était de ne pas perdre l'essence du projet. Alors, c'est là qu'on a pensé à créer cette entité-là qui était syndicat de copropriété, mais à mettre dans ses fondements qui pratiquement assurent l'éternité au projet, c'est de mettre dans ses fondements, je vais vous lire ces quelques lignes, que son acquisition du dit immeuble est l'aboutissement d'un long processus d'organisation et de concertation de la part des citoyens du quartier Milton Park. Regroupés et assistés suivant des formules aussi nombreuses que diverses en vue d'une part de s'opposer au projet de la cité qui menaçait de porter atteinte au caractère socio-économique, physique de leur milieu et d'autre part de s'assurer le contrôle effectif de leurs conditions de vie tout en poursuivant la rénovation des lieux et leur exploitation pour le mieux-être de la collectivité. Donc, cette partie-là, ça venait mettre les fondations du projet pour s'assurer d'une continuité. Un groupe dans Milton Park qui autonome, qui pourrait décider de dire, bon, on vend et on déménage à Ottawa, pourrait le faire, pourrait dire, on vend notre entité, notre coopérative, mais il serait obligé de le vendre à un des groupes, d'abord le vendre à un des groupes de la communauté Milton Park. Donc, ça assure toujours une continuité. Et en plus de ça, pour pouvoir maintenir le profil socio-économique du quartier, à chaque fois qu'il y a une sélection d'un nouveau membre, on a une obligation de choisir dans certaines catégories qu'on a divisé en ABC, comme le pâté chinois, là. Donc, catégorie A, des gens vraiment à faible revenu, catégorie B, des moyens, et des catégories C, des faibles, des revenus pas trop élevés. Fait qu'on a, par ce règlement de base, on a fait en sorte qu'on a pu continuer à maintenir un portrait avec lequel on doit toujours être vigilant. Évidemment, on a toujours tendance à ignorer certaines couches de population, mais on a un outil qui nous permet de suivre finalement ce qui se passe dans chacun des groupes du quartier.
So, does anybody from... Yes.
All right. I'm part of a community collective called Tierra del Fuego. We are housed in Sherbrooke specifically, one of the poorest regions in Quebec, and also one of the regions with the most housing cooperatives in the area in Quebec. Currently, we are facing an issue in the fact that as we are a community housing initiative and not a cooperative housing initiative, that is, we are unofficial, and we also concentrate on neighborhood organization through workshops and potlucks and that type of thing. We are facing a problem right now. That is our land. Right now, the owner is threatening to essentially kick us out, to gentrify us, to create new housing that is not affordable for us. And essentially it would mean the end of the project unless we can either, one, gain control of that land, or two, find land to be able to move on to afterwards. My question essentially is, what are the rights that we are allowed to invoke to ensure that we can protect this type of initiative? And in a larger and more broader context, how can we transition landlord ownership to cooperative ownership? Currently in the United States, when it comes towards housing, there doesn't need to be new housing that's to be built. Because right now, currently the United States has enough housing to give every single homeless person 5 houses or 5 properties to their name. So, yeah.
So one of the questions is how to organize as a tenants group to become a cooperative?
Yeah, that would be it. And regain control over the land that is currently owned by the landlord.
That's a really great question, and I am going to tell you up front that I don't know that I have a great answer for you. I can tell you that there was a similar experience last year in Ottawa in Herongate. So it was one of the most diverse multicultural communities in Ottawa, many newcomers, many single income families. And private landlord was basically looking to tear down those units and pop up, high return, profitable housing, and it was allowed. I mean, we had conversations with housing advocates who said, they're allowed to do it. Should they do it? No. Should the city be seriously looking at policies and bylaws that don't allow rent evictions? Absolutely. And so, I don't know the legal context in Quebec, and I would strongly encourage you to get a hold of housing advocacy organizations to find out what policies exist to stop rent eviction, which is basically what you're describing. And then from there, I'll also say that it's inherently difficult for new cooperatives to start, but there may be opportunities to talk to existing housing co-ops in your neighborhood if they're there, to see how maybe some of their plans include redevelopment or new development where they could prioritize housing members of your association or your community.
Contacted the Federation for Co-Housing Federation, which is in Sherbrooke. And you also have the technical resource group, the GRT, who works with the building of the co-housing. So you have la Fédération des coopératives de l'Estrie and les groupes de ressources techniques. So those are the ones that create the non-for-profit and the co-housing.
I'll just also name drop 2 housing cooperatives that I know of that were successful in fighting to purchase their cooperative assets from landlords. So one is Alexandra Park, which is one of the largest cooperatives in Toronto, where they fought for years and years to purchase a Toronto community housing building. And they were successful, and they created, I can't remember how large it is, but it's really significant win for the sector and for them. And the other is in Ottawa. I can actually see the building from my office, and it's called the Shepherd Housing Cooperative, and it was basically a slum landlord who was not investing in the building and not maintaining it, and the tenants of that building fought tooth and nail to convince the landlord to sell them the units, and they were able to get, in the dying days of provincial housing programs in Ontario, but they were able to get enough funding to create a 36-unit housing co-op in a heritage building, and now they refer to themselves as the Feet First Club, as in the only way that they're leaving their co-op is feet first after.
Another question here?
I want to respond to that. If you look at the Oakland Community Land Trust in the Bay Area, they're a community land trust that specifically created a set of programs to respond to tenants in private buildings that are where their landlords are selling their buildings or looking to upscale their buildings, and so they're trying to find models to work with tenants in buildings like that to transition them to land trust ownership and then cooperatize them. And there's a lot of information on their website, Oakland Community Land Trust. In the Bay Area, they've advocated for there to be specific municipal programs to support the acquisition of private affordable rental housing, the transition into nonprofit ownership. So it's something that, like, your co-op needs to deal with. Of course, you have a specific problem, but you also need to you need to find your partners who are experiencing the same thing and advocate that those partners exist. I don't know if they exist in Montreal. In Toronto recently, we advocated to our local councillor to put a motion to create a pilot program to do this. Not for cooperative housing, but to buy existing rental buildings that are for sale, where we fear the tenants will be displaced by the sale of the property. And we're purchasing our first building this month, May 1st, to save the tenancies, the affordable tenancies. But there's totally money there. You just have to find the path to it. Whether the council, your local representative has access, whether there's an existing program you can access. And I think you should absolutely be putting demands on the co-op sector in and around you, and even start speaking to Milton Park, because they clearly have a huge asset base. So could they finance the purchase of your building? Questions like this are important to start. In the co-op sector, unfortunately, I'm not part of the co-op sector, though I'm very interested in where the co-op sector is going, but needs to think about its future members, right? All the people who need to benefit from a similar housing model, who are struggling in the private market, those are the people who we need to be somehow bringing into the movement for community land trusts and this effort, because we can't just be looking. The co-op sector historically has looked in, but there are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of tenants out in the city struggling against private landlords, and the co-op sector has to step up and somehow bring in those tenants into a movement, right? So those relationships are important, and maybe you can pilot a relationship with Milton Park that could be an example in terms of how tenants in buildings like that want to cooperatize can work with historical co-ops to make that happen.
To follow up on Josh's question about going out from the inward state. I mean, I've been listening to these talks for the past since the conference began. The one word or two words that seem to be missing in all this, which seems to summarize the advanced tendencies of all this, is socialism and communism. I mean, if you're talking about communal ownership of property, if you're talking about taking things out of the marketplace, if you're talking about decommodifying social relationships, you're talking about communism. That's what it means. Now, people are reluctant to use the word, and so the word remains something like the elephant in the room. But I'm now pointing to the elephant in the room, to saying that the only rational alternative to capitalism remains communism. So, in terms of my question, so my question is this. Social democracy doesn't want to talk about this, of course. That's why communism remains the elephant in the room. But let me ask this question to everyone in the panel here. What is your understanding of the cooperative movement's relationship to the historic project of socialism and communism? And do you think such language has its renewed place in your discourse? Also, last words, moi aussi, je parle français et je t'aime en intéressé à parler avec les gens avec lesquels je peux élaborer ce projet. C'est bon, j'ai fini.
I'm holding the microphone. I feel very lucky. Well, a little while ago, I slipped the reference to the difference between use value and exchange value into my remarks, and nobody had a heart attack. So that's a good sign. I mean, the cooperative movement has its own history, its own set of values. You know, I appreciate the historical reference to models of socialism and communism, but I'm a pragmatist when it comes to messaging, and my interest is in not so much in ascribing the right terminology to the cooperative housing venture as it is to building community support and government support at all levels, and if that means you know, a little shading around the edges when and a little being a little more timid than I might otherwise be when it comes to using certain terms, then I'll take that hit to get the housing for the communities that we need. And I do want to say I appreciate, because he'll do it reliably. Josh calling out the co-op housing movement for its inward-looking tendencies and the need to broaden our horizons to include representing the interests of future members. I think you're absolutely right, and I don't want you to stop calling us out on that until we deliver what you're wanting. I have a hunch that you won't. So.
It's just an opportunity. It's the biggest opportunity you have, really,
Yeah.
is to be relevant to the rest of society that also needs the same thing.
Well, you know, and I mean, to bring it around to a problem that we're wrestling with in Vancouver, which is the renewal of 50 co-op leases on City of Vancouver land. You know, one of the knocks against renewing those leases on the kinds of favorable terms that we want are that housing co-op members in some of those co-ops are already the most comfortably housed people in the, you know, what you might broadly call the social housing sector, and city council, new council, doesn't want to be seen to be giving disproportionately more benefits to people who actually have it okay now, relative to the very dramatic housing crisis we see in Vancouver. So it's a question of, when it comes to the question of how to distribute, even with the added investment of government, a very scarce housing pie to all the people who need and want it, if we don't show that we're willing to step up and be part of a more aggressive solution to the housing crisis, then we're going to get passed over on some of those conversations.
I don't know that I have anything to add, so I'm gonna cop out.
Didn't think the microphone was going to be such a hot potato.
So we have five minutes left, so maybe 2 more questions, and we'll take the one in the front and then somebody in the back. I can't see. Just keep your hand up so I can see who you are. Okay.
Ma question est sur sustainability. Donc, je suis architecte, donc je ne peux pas me passer de poser cette question. Building sustainability, your point of view, the future of la suite de l'écologie dans les bâtiments.
So I'll just repeat the question for
Yes.
folks in the back. It's an architect here in the front who is asking about building ecology and environmental sustainability, and posing the question back on us about is it existing or for future?
Your point of view, the future, is it an issue? Do members talk about it in Vancouver, Toronto, elsewhere, etc.?
So I mean, I'll just start by saying I have a personal commitment to environmental sustainability, and and have worked on passive house, LEED Gold developments in Vancouver and in Ottawa as a development consultant. So I would bring that sensibility to any new development that I would be working on within the co-op sector.
Bonne question. So I can tell you that as co-ops have been coming to the end of their operating agreements, we went through something called 2020 Vision, which was sort of a conversation that housing co-ops had internally focused on their long-term sustainability as organizations. And that focused on financial sustainability, on the sustainability of the governance management social model, and then on the environmental sustainability piece as well. And that was certainly one of the pillars of that program. And every co-op has internalized it in a different way. What I will say is moving forward, we have to be conscious of the fact that many of the co-ops built in historical governmentally funded programs were focused on getting slapped together and put up as quickly as possible so that they could meet the needs of people who needed housing desperately. And I think that one of the challenges that we have as we're in a renewed housing crisis these days is to not make that same mistake and not just invest in not only to look at trying to keep our carbon footprint low, trying to reduce emissions as much as possible, but we also have to look at the long-term viability of buildings. We have co-ops that have 100-year-old buildings that, there's one co-op that I work with in Westboro in Ottawa. They have townhouses that were built the year I was born. 30 years old, and they need more capital repair and more work than the homes that were built 100 years ago. And they're looking at their building condition assessments and realizing that the asset management plan for buildings that were built 35 years ago on the cheap, frankly, that those buildings are less sustainable than the ones that were built that may leak all kinds of heat and energy, but the reality is that it's not a viable and sustainable model to build something that will have to be torn down and rebuilt after 35 years, and we have to think about how we address that challenge and reconcile the difference between affordable housing development and creating affordable models that provide good quality housing for much longer than they have in recent years.
I didn't think that we would actually have a concrete example to refer to, but we had to modify our development plans on our townhomes along the Fraser River as a direct consequence of climate change when the city took 50 meters off our foreshore because they revised the floodplain projections, and our setbacks made us change the building form, and we couldn't fit as many of the townhomes that we'd originally planned into that configuration. So for us to turn around and not try to build climate change projections into our designs would just be foolhardy. The BC building code's already pretty green. I just wish municipalities who were requiring certain performance around affordability would recognize in their pro formas the additional capital cost, the upfront investment required to build truly green, the costs which are easily recovered in the life cycle of the building, but not recognized upfront as a legitimate capital expense. That would make our job a lot easier. But we're doing things like hooking up to neighborhood energy utilities where sewage is used to heat co-op and nonprofit and private homes. But there's still a lot more work to do.
Moi, ce que je peux dire, c'est un peu la même situation de très vieux bâtiments durs avec des plafonds qui ressemblent aux plafonds comme on a ici, de les maintenir en état déjà, on considère que c'est de faire beaucoup. Et les actions au niveau du quartier, ça se fait au niveau de ruelles vertes, de fermer des ruelles. Dernièrement, je ne sais pas s'il y a des gens de ma coop ici, non? Je peux me prononcer. Dans ma propre coopérative, on a voté pour abolir 9 stationnements et planter des arbres. On est au niveau de la population, je pense pas, enfin moi mon impression c'est, je pense pas qu'on soit des leaders au niveau de l'environnement, peut-être que je me trompe, au niveau des bâtiments existants. On fait des efforts au moment des rénovations, c'est plus là que ça se passe à ce que j'en vois dans notre quartier.
I think there was one, I mean, like every good discussion, we could carry it on. There was one question in the back, and we'll make that our last question, and then please feel free to approach us afterwards.
Hi, I just wanted to add a couple things comment-wise. Regarding the architectural question, which I think it's great to raise that. Given the direction planetary resources are going at this, like, what we need to go toward is adapting, retrofitting, working with the resources that already are present rather than continuing to extract new materials and use new things for construction. It's going to all be about creativity and reworking what's materials are already available. However, to add a note, I think that changing some codes and paradigms around preservation of heritage building is going to be important as well. I think that preserving what heritage features we can is important, but it also is often at this point in contradiction to the needs of simple accessibility. In many of these housing and public structures, people with various disabilities are living longer and more publicly now than in times that these heritage buildings were created. And just to accommodate that reality, we need to have code change in that respect. As to the question that the comrade based in Sherbrooke had raised also, I think it would be really great if one outcome from this whole weekend conference could be gathering of resource information as he was querying about, because for myself, I'm fairly new in Quebec, less than 2 years. I haven't gone to learn French yet, but I know that there are people here who could gather this information about what are present laws that could support their work in Sherbrooke and through the province. And likewise, there's the emails of all the people who've registered for this through Eventbrite. You know, we could get sent to everybody who has come to participate the information of the kind of nationally applicable and international examples. That's something I would really love to see happen, this kind of information sharing to come at the end of this.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, and round of applause here for our panelists. Break time.